Well, let's open the Bible to Mark chapter 7, and we'll start at verse 1. Mark 7, verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who'd come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Let's pick it up from verse 14. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean." So as we dive into this chapter, I have three questions to help us. Firstly, what does uncleanness have to do with us? Secondly, why are those feelings so persistent? And then lastly, what can be done about it? So firstly, what has uncleanness got to do with us? I wonder if you remember the most terrifying of all of Shakespeare's plays. I remember reading it at school because it was the shortest of Shakespeare's tragedies, and I was also quite a lazy student, so that's probably why I read it. But the most terrifying play, I think, is Macbeth. You may know the background. This is the basic setup. Lady Macbeth wants her husband, Macbeth, to be king. There's only one small problem. There is already a rightful king on the throne. So the two of them, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, plot to murder the king. And there is this terrifying moment. There's this very famous scene called the sleepwalking scene. It happens immediately after they murder the king. And you see Lady Macbeth sleepwalking. And as she sleepwalks, she holds her hands in front of her face and she desperately tries to wash them clean of the blood that she can see on them. And no matter how hard she rubs her hands together, she just cannot get rid of this blood. Because, of course, it's not real blood. It's a projection of her moral uncleanness before a perfectly holy and perfectly righteous God. It's a terrifying moment because as she stares at her hands, she knows that she cannot get clean. There is nothing she can do to get rid of it, and she knows just where that uncleanness is going to take her, to a judgment before God, a judgment that she cannot possibly bear. Now, of course, not all of us have actually committed murder, but we do all have the same moral problem. If God is infinitely pure and infinitely holy, and we are not, then how can we possibly spend even a millisecond in his presence? All of us, if we're honest, have feelings of uncleanness, of unworthiness. We might call it shame or guilt, but all of us have these feelings. Now, some of that, of course, is what we might call false guilt. Some of us have very sensitive consciences, and sometimes we feel guilty for things that actually we shouldn't feel guilty for. But there are a great number of things that we should feel guilty for, things we should have said, done, or thought. Maybe things that we know we should not have said, done, or thought. And these religious leaders here in Mark chapter 7 are trying to clean themselves of all this uncleanness. In fact, they are remarkably similar to Lady Macbeth. Can you see in verse 3, they refuse to eat anything unless they've given their hands a ceremonial washing. And then verse 4, They had many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. All this cleaning, all designed to make them acceptable to enter God's presence. They've been locked in a feverish nightmare of washing compulsively over and over again, because they realise that this human stain, if I can put it that way, just will not come off. It's incredibly persistent. And that brings us to the second question. Why are these feelings of uncleanness so persistent? Why don't they go away? Well, certainly not for lack of trying. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to try and get clean, and which one we choose will depend on whether we consider ourselves religious or not. If we're not religious, we'll probably assume that the feelings of uncleanness and guilt will go away if we change our actions or change our circumstances or change the way we think about things. For example, a lot of people feel that our feelings of uncleanness are because of our upbringing. They're just a throwback to the way that our parents brought us up, or possibly they're a throwback to our religious past. So, what's the solution? Very simple. You just simply get rid of religion, and that will stop you feeling guilt, that will stop you feeling shame, and you're clean. The other solution is, if we're religious, we will try to get clean by doing all sorts of other things. We'll do something maybe like these religious leaders are doing. Maybe we'll be baptized. Maybe we'll try to make ourselves clean by praying and reading the Bible every day, by going to church every week, by taking communion. Maybe we'll even avoid certain sorts of people and certain sorts of places because we think that all these things will make us clean in themselves. Now, according to Jesus, both the non-religious way of cleaning and the religious way of cleaning are deeply, deeply flawed. And here's why. They both have the same limitation. They only work on the outside, the externals, the surface, the appearance, the symptoms rather than the disease itself. And Jesus says our uncleanness isn't external, it is deep, it is internal, it's out of reach. Beyond self-help, beyond therapy, beyond reform, and beyond religion. Look at what Jesus says in verse 14. Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. In other words, regardless of what foods you eat, what foods you avoid, or how clean your hands are when you eat, your heart is already unclean. You may have been baptized. You may go to church every week and read your Bible and pray every single day, but none of that will change the fact that your heart is unclean. Just in case we've missed it, Jesus says it another way in verse 18, and then in verse 20, look at that. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean, for from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. So if your heart has ever produced any of these things on this list, then according to Jesus, you're already unclean. And so am I. Just like Lady Macbeth, even with compulsive washing, we are incapable of making our hearts clean because our uncleanness is not on the surface, it's deep, unreachable. You know, it's interesting, even non-Christian sources acknowledge the uncleanness of the human heart. Gandhi, Buddha, even the atheistic philosopher Nietzsche, all of them say the same thing. Even if we are apparently doing good things, it's always for selfish reasons, unclean motives, and that's why the feelings of uncleanness persist. At the beginning of his autobiography, Gandhi quotes a poet in order to describe himself. It's a remarkable statement that he makes. He says this, "Where is there a wretch so wicked and loathsome as I? I have forsaken my Maker, so faithless have I been, for it is an unbroken torture to me that I am still so far from him who, as I fully know, governs every breath of my life, and whose offspring I am. I know that it is the evil passions within that keep me so far from him, and yet I cannot get away from them." End quote. We can't get away from them because we carry this unclean heart inside us wherever we go and whatever we do. And even though we carry it everywhere, it's out of our reach. You know, it's interesting, in that scene where Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking, there's someone else on stage. There's a doctor who is watching her as she endlessly tries to clean her hands. And do you know what he says? He says this. He says, "More needs she, the divine, than the physician." In other words, she needs more than a doctor. She needs God. And that brings me to Jesus himself, because Jesus is both. He talks about himself as a doctor in Mark chapter 2, but also again and again he reveals himself to be divine as God come to earth. And that means not only can Jesus diagnose our uncleanness in the way we've just seen him do, it also means he can do something about it. So to our final question, what can be done about our uncleanness? Look at what happens immediately after our reading. Verse 24. Jesus leaves the Jewish area he was in. He deliberately goes to the vicinity of Tyre, which was a Gentile city. It was a non-Jewish city. He meets a woman, verse 26, who is Greek, born in Syrophoenicia. Now that seems like an odd detail to include until you realise one thing. As far as Jewish culture was concerned, this woman was unclean. And yet Jesus, humanly speaking, a Jewish man, deliberately makes an arduous journey, about 30 miles, into a place that would have been thought of as unclean. And then he not only talks with this unclean woman, he heals her unclean daughter. We read in the Greek that she has an unclean spirit. Do you see the significance of that? Religious solutions only deal with the outside. Non-religious solutions only deal with the outside. But here, by healing this girl, Jesus demonstrates that he has the power to clean us on the inside. And notice the way he does it. The only way he can do it is by becoming unclean himself, by going into unclean territory and identifying with unclean people. In other words, sacrificing himself so that they can be made clean, taking on their uncleanness so that they could take on his cleanness, if I can put it that way. And although Jesus makes a long and difficult journey to save this little girl, do you know how far he travelled to save you? To the cross. He knows that all of us, with all of our moral and spiritual uncleanness, will one day face the judgment of a perfectly holy, perfectly righteous God. And we cannot possibly bear it. That is why when Jesus died, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because at that moment, he was suffering what we will suffer if we come before God with an unclean heart. Separation, forsakenness. That's why he cried that out. If you've put your trust in Jesus, therefore, it means that God will never again see your heart as unclean. And do you realise, Christian, that because Jesus has taken your place, you take his? God will always see you in the same way he sees his Son, perfectly pure, perfectly holy, perfectly clean. Now, as we finish, I guess all of us will be in one of two camps. Some of us will agree with Jesus' diagnosis of the human heart, and some will respectfully disagree. Either way, can I say the cross speaks directly to you? To those who look into their hearts and say, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but basically I think I'm a good person. To you, the cross says this: if the state of your heart is not that serious, then why did the eternal Son of God have to come to earth and die on a cross in order to make it clean? Put your trust in him. Let him take your uncleanness. But the cross speaks differently to those who do see their uncleanness. To you, the cross says this: it's true, you are unclean. It was infinitely costly to put that right. But at the same time, can you see how much you are loved? Christ not only gave his life for you, he gave his cleanness to you. He gave it for people who know their hearts are beyond self-help, beyond therapy, beyond reform, and beyond religion. Put your trust in him then, and be made clean.